Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. I've been away for a little while. We've got a newborn here. Actually, you can kind of see her little. I think it's right over here. Little bouncer I've got in my office and stuff. And so we've been a little bit preoccupied, a little bit busy with this baby. But I'm excited to get back and start to get back into the swing of things with shows on Capturing Christianity. And today, what we're doing is addressing the moral argument for God's existence, which in the popular level. I was talking about this with my guest before we went live. On the popular level, this argument's not really taken too seriously by folks that are sort of more informed in philosophy of religion. And by that, I mean like theists and atheists alike. But what's interesting, and I think we'll talk about this in the course of the show. Let me go ahead and bring my guest in now, Dr. Adam Lloyd Johnson. We were talking about this, that it may not be taken too seriously by popular level folks who are doing apologetics work on both sides, on YouTube and stuff like that. Facebook, people are commenting on Facebook. But at the academic level, the moral argument, and by the moral argument, there's all sorts of different moral arguments that have been raised. So it's important to kind of specify which argument we're talking about here. I'm talking about the traditional, I call it the traditional moral argument. It's the argument that if you've been engaged in apologetics for a while, the kind of argument that you probably have in mind when someone says the moral argument is the argument that Dr. William Lane Craig raises, which is premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. And then the conclusion just follows logically, God exists. So a lot of atheists have taken issue with both of those premises. But the point that I wanted to make it initially is that this argument's not really taken too seriously in the popular level, but when it comes to the academic level, it seems like we've got a different story. Is that correct, Adam?
Yeah, I would say so. When I first got into it really in depth 10, 12 years ago now, I was amazed to find work on the moral argument at the highest academic level. And I'm talking about people like Robert Adams, John Hare at Yale, and folks like that. So, and those on the other side as well. Non-Christians, atheists who are pushing back against it, Eric Wielenberg and others. So no, I think it is taken seriously at some of the highest academic levels.
And you've focused a good portion of your work on Dr. Eric Wielenberg, who I've had on the show before. He's actually been on to defend moral realism. That was a really fun show several years ago at this point. But you focused a lot of your work on his work, which he basically attempts to provide a naturalistic account of objective morality from, to sort of reiterate, from a naturalistic perspective. So, and I think what that shows is that, Dr. Eric Wielenberg, I think, is probably one of the people that's at the forefront of like the academic level who is responding to these sorts of moral arguments. And yet what we see from him is that he's taking it very seriously, attempting to provide a robust naturalistic account. So, but why don't we take a step back? And the title of the show today is why the moral argument isn't as bad as some people think. Okay, so why don't we get into what are some of the reasons that people maybe aren't too impressed by the moral argument? I can share some of my thoughts, but let me get yours before I share mine.
Sure. Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I find other arguments for God to be more compelling personally. So, and this has always been the case for me, even though I'm probably most well known for the moral argument. If you would ask me, just on a personal level, what arguments for God do you find most compelling? I would go, first of all, to first cause arguments, design arguments. I find those arguments for God to be more compelling than the moral argument. That isn't to say that the moral argument is a bad argument. I just find those others to be more compelling. And so when I started my PhD research in philosophy of religion, one of the things that I attempted to do was find an area that I could work in, try to be helpful in a certain area. And so when I considered the different arguments for God and the moral argument, I saw some weaknesses in it, some things that I liked, didn't like. And so part of my motivation to work in this area was to strengthen the moral argument. My very first paper that I wrote on the moral argument, I think it might even still been in my master's degree program, was titled Strengthening the Moral Argument.
I'm looking at the chat now, and a guy named Lance is saying he works in meta ethics, and that seems well. He says that he almost never sees God come up in discussions about meta ethics. Do you think that that's true? Or I mean, when it comes to like philosophers who are ethicists or discussing meta ethics, does God rarely come up, or what is your perspective as someone who's worked in this field?
Yeah, well, he's coming up more and more, especially if you look at folks, as I mentioned, like John Hare and Robert Adams. People are taking them more and more seriously. I mean, these are guys at the highest academic level. But yeah, if you go to a standard, again, it all depends on who's teaching the class, right? But if you go to a standard metaethics class or ethical theory class at a college or university, or you're reading a text that's just broadly covering metaethics, sometimes, again, depending on who wrote it, who's teaching the class, they might mention some of the historical figures who have argued for God, and leave out some of these contemporary figures. But it's definitely a growing movement. There's no doubt.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to discuss one of the more common objections to the moral argument. We're just gonna kind of dive right into some of the nitty gritty details. One of the objections that comes up so often is the Euthyphro dilemma. I mean, I see it from atheists like Ben Watkins, who is a contributor over at Real Atheology. He's a very big proponent of the Euthyphro dilemma. Actually, the Euthyphro dilemma, I hosted a discussion on that argument or that objection several years ago. It's actually one of my favorite discussions I've ever hosted on this channel to this day. It's that good. It was with his name is Jason Thibodeau's The Atheist, but the Christian Matt Flanagan. The dialogue that they had was so good. Again, it's one of my favorite shows that I've ever hosted on the Euthyphro dilemma. But it's a very common objection. Let's just run through kind of like what the objection is, and then how it's sort of viewed currently, because a lot of people think that it's just like a decisive objection to grounding morality in God, whereas people at the academic level don't really see it that way. So let's just get into, we won't spend the whole show talking about this topic, but just a quick rundown of what the argument actually is, or what the objection is.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's interesting because, yeah, it depends on who you talk to, I guess. But for example, Eric Wielenberg, the atheist that I often interact with on these issues, he would say that the Euthyphro dilemma has been so well answered by theists for centuries now that he's actually trying and advocating that he and his fellow atheists would move away from the Euthyphro dilemma because it's been so well answered. So if I could just set up the dilemma real quick, and I'll put it in contemporary terms, I won't go back and quote the original dilemma, but how it's usually presented in contemporary terms is theists have to choose one horn of this dilemma. Two horns are presented in the dilemma, and then supposedly theists are forced to have to choose one of the two horns. And the two options as they're presented is either is something good because God commands it, or is something good because, or does God command something because it's good, or is something good because God commands it? And so it seems like Christians or theists would want to reject both options, right? We don't want morality to be arbitrary. That seems to be one horn of the dilemma that just would make morality arbitrary. If God could just command any crazy thing, like we should all eat kittens for breakfast, then that would make that good. And so we seems that we would want to avoid that horn of the dilemma. And then we'd want to avoid the other horn of the dilemma, this idea that something, God commands something because it's good, because then that makes something else the determinator of what's good instead of God, that he commands it because it's good. And so that seems to make goodness something apart from God. And that's something that historically theists have wanted to reject as well. And the classic response to the Euthyphro dilemma, and this might even go back to Plato himself, some argue that when Plato laid out the Euthyphro dilemma, that he, in fact, gave the answer to it right there in the text, responded to it. But even if that's not the case, theists for centuries have said, look, there's another option. You don't have to take either of those horns. And the option that's always been presented is that God himself is the good. And so he is the determinator. His nature, his moral and just nature, just is the good. And so he commands something because he is good. And he is, you could use the word restricted or constrained, to only command those things that align with his moral nature. Now, we can get into more of the nitty gritty. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But in a quick summary, that would be the way the Euthyphro dilemma is usually answered.
Yeah, and then one of the responses that's often given when you say that there's like this third option, doesn't have to be just these two, is to say, well, all that does is it pushes the can down the road, so to speak. It just pushes the objection back a level. It's like, well, then is God's nature good? Because I think that, I mean, the responses that I've seen to the Euthyphro dilemma, they focus on, if at least at first, they focus on the obligations part. Does God command it? Does God command it because it's already good, or is it good and then God commands it? But if we answer the commands part, God commands it because he's good. And then if you change the objection to like, well, what about God's nature? Is God's nature good because it's like already good, or is it good because God? But what I think the correct response is, well, the bit about the commands part, moral obligations, deontology, like that part has been answered. Okay, so if you think that now we can switch from discussing deontology to axiology, we're switching from asking where obligations come from to asking where axiology comes from. It's a different question, right? You can say, well, even if God's commands are grounded in the good, you could even admit the theist, the divine command theorist, could admit that when it comes to axiology, that's grounded in, say, Platonic forms or something outside of God. The theist could actually admit that, but then just say that when it comes to moral obligations, deontology, that has to be grounded in God's commands. And so, and that's obviously contentious. So like a lot of theists do think that even when it comes to axiology, the nature of God and stuff like that still needs a divine origin. So that's contentious. But the point that I want to make here is that if you switch the Euthyphro dilemma from discussing originally deontology to discussing axiology, where axiology comes from, and if we've got this dilemma here when it comes to axiology, it's a separate question. And the divine command theorist could just accept that when it comes to axiology, there is some non-divine origin of the good. But when it comes to commands, which is really the central part of the moral argument, is really focusing most of the time, at least contemporary arguments, style arguments, are focused on moral obligations. So any thoughts on that before we kind of switch gears?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I would say it would be better to focus in this conversation not on moral obligations, but on moral values. So what makes something not right or wrong, moral obligations, moral duties, but go back a step and focus more on what is good and bad, what makes a human action good or bad. I think that's more fundamental and really easier to get our hands around. Moral obligation is more tricky. But going back to your point of just pushing the Euthyphro dilemma back one step, there's so many parallels here to the first cause argument, right? So I might disagree with you. I don't think it would be a move that us theists or us Christians should make to say that there is some sort of external standard apart from God that defines the good. I still would want to maintain that God just is the good. So let me draw up these parallels between the first cause argument for God and where the moral argument ends up. And I think the Euthyphro dilemma kind of shows us where the moral argument ends up, with God as the good. So with the first cause argument, as you very well know, there's really only two options, right? There's either an infinite series of causes that have come prior to us. They go back forever, right? Infinity past, an infinite amount of causes, or there was a first cause. And I don't see how there can be any other options. And mathematicians, philosophers have shown that having an actual infinite series is illogical, impossible. And so we're left with this idea of there being a first cause. And people at one point thought the universe was the uncaused cause, right? The universe was the thing that's always been around. It didn't have a beginning. It's always been there. It didn't have a cause. But we know that's not the case. The universe had a beginning. It can't be the uncaused cause. And we as Christians, theists, propose that God is the best candidate for this first cause, this uncaused cause. And so whatever you're proposing as the first cause, to ask of that thing, well, what caused that, is nonsensical. It's the uncaused cause. When people thought the universe was the uncaused cause, to ask, well, what caused the universe, would be nonsensical. Nothing caused the universe. It's been around forever. There's got to be a stopping point. To end the infinite regress, there's got to be a stopping point, right? Well, if you carry all that parallel over to the moral argument, it's almost the exact same thing, where you go back far enough in any moral theory, not just a theistic moral theory. In any moral theory, you're eventually going to hit a stopping point. Otherwise, there's going to be an infinite regress. G.E. Moore really helped people understand this, I think, with his open question argument. G.E. Moore was one of the founders of analytic philosophy in the early 1900s, and he had this open question dilemma, open question argument, which I think succinctly communicates this very well. And he was dealing mostly with utilitarians, but basically he was saying, look, anything that you reduce morality to, let's say it's the harm principle. That's very common among atheists. Something is morally bad if it causes harm. Something is morally good if it avoids causing harm, so on and so forth. Well, G.E. Moore's open question dilemma would basically say to any naturalistic theory that tries to reduce morality to some sort of natural property, the open question is always going to be, well, why is that good? Why is not causing harm good? Or if you say, good is what causes human flourishing, you could say, well, why is human flourishing a good thing? And so G.E. Moore said, ultimately, in order to stop this kind of a similar, infinite series, well, why is that good? Well, then why is that good? Well, then why is that good? The buck has got to stop somewhere. There's got to be some ultimate good. And he is much like Wielenberg. In fact, Wielenberg is Morean in this sense, and that he just proposes there are just these brute ethical facts, right? And G.E. Moore did the same thing. Well, alternatively, we're saying as Christians that God is where the buck stops. To avoid that infinite regress, why is that good? Why is that good? Why is that good? There's just an ultimate starting point, stopping point, however you want to say it, where the buck stops. And that is God. God is the good. There's nothing behind him that caused him, and there's nothing behind him that makes him good or that we can be measured to be good. He just is the good. And every moral theory has to have some sort of ultimate like that. Just like there has to be an ultimate cause in the first cause argument, there's got to be an ultimate good. And we're just saying that God seems to be the best candidate for that.
Well, I like how you're pointing out the similarities between cosmological arguments and moral arguments, where there is this big focus on where do explanations stop? What is the best stopping point for explanations? When it comes to the universe, you've got to have some sort of foundational item that explains everything else. What could that item look like? People like Josh Rasmussen are saying, well, it's got to be a perfect being because perfect beings have no sort of unexplained arbitrary limits. Whereas if you want to posit some natural thing, it's going to have some finite limit in value and in power and stuff. And that's just going to raise some little paradoxes and stuff. But I like how you're pointing out the similarities between the arguments. And this might actually be a good point to sort of plug your book here, right? That you've published not too long ago, Divine Love Theory. Why don't you talk about your book and some of the views that you've outlined here, where you basically give an account of why God is the best account of axiology value.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So maybe it's a little bit of history of the book. As I said, when I was working on my PhD and even in my master's degree, I was looking for ways to strengthen the moral argument because I found other arguments more compelling, wanted to work in this area, see if I could strengthen the moral argument. And I have always approached the moral argument a little bit differently. I follow more of David Baggett's approach, if you're familiar with him, which is to say it's more of an abductive approach. So I would lay out the argument very simply a bit differently than the way that you have following Craig's example. I would start out with premise one, saying that premise one, there are objective moral truths. Premise two, God seems to be the best explanation for these objective moral truths. Therefore, conclusion number three, we have good reason to believe that there is, in fact, a God. So it's more of an abductive approach, following David Baggett's lead in this. It's an inference to the best explanation. And I like that approach better than, let's say, a more deductive approach that Craig often uses. So in my work in the moral argument, I always felt that the first premise was the most difficult premise to argue for. And the first premise being that there are objective moral truths. Because that premise, it's different, right, than the first cause or design arguments that usually begin with some sort of, you could say a scientific phenomenon, right, or some phenomenon in physical reality, if you will, right? The universe is fine-tuned, the universe has a cause, there's something like that. But with the moral argument, you're starting with something that's a bit more abstract and something that might be more difficult to prove because you can't really, you can't do a scientific experiment on love or justice, morality. And so it seems like that first premise I've always thought is the most difficult premise to argue for. And it seems like if somebody is going to believe in objective morality, it's going to be almost more of a self-evident, intuitive, just grasping this, almost like when you see the equation 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, no, I don't really have to do any sort of proof of that or evidence of that because it's just self-evident. And morality seems to be like that for the vast majority of people. And so a lot of people do agree with that first premise. They think that there are objective moral truths. And so if somebody is already on board with that first premise, then I think the second premise is very strong. I think the second premise that God is the best explanation for objective moral truth, I think that is a very, very strong premise. But if somebody doesn't hold to objective moral truth to begin with, I think the moral argument has a difficult job of getting off the ground, so to speak, of beginning. And so that's what kind of drew me into the conversation. And very soon, very quickly, as I started to do research and kind of canvassed the scene of who was saying what, discovered Eric Wielenberg, and come to find out he already accepts premise one. So that made my job a little bit easier. He already accepts that there is objective moral truth, but then disagrees with the second premise. He doesn't think God's the best explanation for that objective moral truth. And so that drew me in because I wanted to defend premise two. I thought that was a much stronger premise, and began a series of writing against Wielenberg and pushing back against his theory. And he wrote some of the stuff that I put together. Some of my work got published. He read it. We started interacting. A very super nice guy. He gave me great feedback and started pushing back on my theory. And as a Christian, I just thought, my theory was simple. God's the best explanation of morality. But as he started pushing back on my theory, I realized that, it needs to be more nuanced than that. And that's what led me to develop my own theory of exactly how God is the source and foundation of morality. And that is what I call my divine love theory. So the book is a compare contrast, my theory, my divine love theory, my explanation of objective morality compared and contrast with Eric Wielenberg's, arguing that mine is the better explanation. And he's read the book. He wrote an endorsement on the back cover of the book, which I really appreciated. He disagrees, obviously, with my conclusion, but as you can read on the endorsement, says that it's good work and people should take it seriously. And I really appreciated him writing that endorsement for the book.
Well, let's get into your compare and contrast of your theory versus Eric's theory, which I think is becoming more and more popular. Like people are sort of gravitating, or at least naturalists and stuff are gravitating toward his moral theory. But let's first back up a little bit and talk about that first premise, because a lot of ethicists, and by first premise I mean the premise that objective morality is real, right? So there's a lot of ethicists right now that are accepting this, and this is not just theists; it's atheists as well. It's becoming, I think, the majority position currently,
I
actually.
agree.
In So let's discuss some of the reasons why ethicists are being more and more drawn to objective morality in the first place. Before we get to comparing and contrasting these theories of objective morality.
Yeah. No, that's good. And you're exactly right. It is becoming the majority position, at least among academic professional philosophers. It might not be the majority position at the popular level yet, but definitely among academic atheist philosophers, it is now the majority position. And you go back, 40, 30, 40, 50 years, and what was really in vogue was postmodernism, subjective morality, relativism, right? I got my undergrad at the University of Nebraska in the 90s, and I remember so many of my professors talking about relative morality and pushing that very hard. But the tides are changing. And what's happened now is the vast majority do affirm that there are objective moral truths. And I think it's because it's just so much more intuitive. It's so hard to consistently believe in that morality is just purely subjective. It's very, very difficult to hold on to that consistently. It's one thing to sit in a college classroom and kind of postulate about it, but then to live it out in reality, it's very, very difficult to be consistent. And so I think a lot of these academic philosophers have just realized it makes a lot more sense that there are just objective moral truths. And a lot of it, I think, too, comes with the cultural tides that we're experiencing, where people are really fired up about certain moral issues, whether that be racism or oppression. But I think there's a realization that, look, this we can't be fired up about these things if they're just subjective opinions. These things have to be objectively true, otherwise they're not going to hold water. So I'm thankful for this shift, right? And there's good arguments. We can get into them if you'd like, but there's good thought experiments and arguments that morality is objectively true. Moral realism might be the more appropriate philosophical term. And there's some good work I could pull off the shelf, even by atheists who make excellent arguments for moral realism.
Yeah, one of the arguments that I actually really like for moral realism is basically the connection between epistemic duties and moral duties. So, like, and this is going to appeal, I think, to those of you that are watching that are more skeptically minded. I think most people, or a lot of skeptics, I'll say, have this intuition that we have duties when it comes to our intellect, and think like we've got to basically, if we want to hold some belief, we've got to have evidence for it. For example, like that's one of the sort of epistemic rules that exists for forming like good, reliable beliefs, okay, or justified beliefs. So, but what a lot of ethicists have pointed out is that if you think that there are these sort of epistemic duties where you've got to basically do certain things in order to be justified in your belief, if you've got to do things, then the same is, I think, going to apply to moral beliefs, because in a lot of the same ways, like there's just a ton of similarities between our thoughts about the epistemic realm and our thoughts about the moral realm. So maybe I can now pass it over to you and kind of maybe help me explain this idea a little bit better, and we'll discuss that just a little bit, and then we can move into to your theory.
Yeah. No, I like that. One of the things that I often use are thought experiments. Sometimes when you're trying to make the case for something, in this case, moral realism, you can put forth the alternative, right? If moral realism was false or if subjectivism was true, and show the absurdities that would result, reductio ad absurdum, you could call them, and just to show how absurd it would be if moral realism was false. So I think those are some helpful ways to make a case for objective moral truth as well. But again, I think this is the more difficult premise, right? Because if somebody is just going to dig in their heels and just claim that they don't believe in objective moral truth, I think it can be difficult to then get to premise two. But no, I think that there are good There are good, solid reasons to believe in moral realism. It's just a more difficult premise to argue for, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose I can also just remind the audience really quickly that I have had Eric Wielenberg on the show. This was several years ago at this point, and he actually defends moral realism. So if you guys are interested in a sort of secular atheistic defense of moral realism, then go check out that show. Let's go. Let's turn now to Dr. Johnson. Let's get your comparative analysis of your view versus Eric's view.
Yeah. So,
by the way, what were you looking for back there?
I was going to grab a book off the shelf, and somebody I think who does a really good job making a case for objective moral truth. But I'll try to find that later if we have time, or we can put it in the comments below later.
Sure.
As I said before, I kind of started this a little bit naively. In terms of just saying, yeah, God's the best explanation for objective morality. That seems pretty obvious to me. But as Wielenberg and others, push back on my thoughts, push back on my explanation of morality, I realized that I needed to develop a more detailed explanation of exactly how God is the source and foundation of morality. And so I did a lot of research, obviously, in my PhD program, studying the various theories that have been proposed through the centuries. Divine command theory, natural law theory are the two big ones. There's other ones, of course, divine will theory, divine motivation theory, so on and so forth. A lot of similarities between them, but there are differences. And in the midst of that, I started to develop my own theory, taking the best from everything I was reading, of course. We stand on the shoulders of giants always. But a lot of my theory does piggyback off of Robert Adams' theory. His book, Finite and Infinite Goods, is a classic, 25 years old now. But he has just been a huge force in this area of Christian metaethics. So highly recommend his book, Finite and Infinite Goods. And he would consider himself a modified divine command theorist. I don't refer to my theory as a divine command theory. It incorporates some things from divine command theory traditionally, but really in my theory, divine commands play a pretty small role. And my theory is actually built more on, I would say the foundation of my theory is the Trinitarian relationships. So as you can see on the subtitle of my book, I argue that the Trinity, and in particular, the loving relationships between the Trinitarian members, Father, Son, and Spirit, those loving relationships are the source and foundation of morality. And so I fleshed out my theory, using scripture, using general revelation, special revelation, scripture, and general revelation, philosophical arguments and such, fleshed out my theory, explaining theologically, if you will, how God is the source and foundation of morality, in particular the Trinity, and then compare and contrast that with Eric Wielenberg's theory, and show how my theory has much more explanatory power and explains the moral realm that we experience so much better than Wielenberg's theory. Now, I do have one additional point that I'd like to say about how I developed my theory, but it might take me a minute or two. But I wanted to pause to see if you wanted to say something, interrupt, or ask a question maybe.
No. Feel free to continue.
Okay. I don't want to go on for too long at once, but one last thing I'd like to say about my theory is some people have, I don't want to say disliked it, or some people have been a little bit surprised that I'm bringing, let's say, for instance, scripture and theology into my theory, because they think that, again, maybe going back to more of a deductive approach with the moral argument, that you have to start with the phenomenon, in this case, objective moral truth, and then build everything on top of that. And so some people, when they've just heard of my theory, would say things like, oh my goodness, you think that you can make a case for the Trinity from objective moral truth? And no, that's not the case at all. I'm not doing this deductively. It's more of an abductive approach. It looks like my battery's about to run out. Let me go grab the my power cord real quick. Just give me about a
Okay,
minute.
sure, sure, no problem. In the meantime, I can kind of plug the book a little bit. Divine Love Theory, I think it was published not too long ago. And let me see when the published date was. I was actually meaning to have Dr. Johnson on when it was around the time that it was published, but we just didn't get around to it. Something also cool that you guys may not know is that Dr. Johnson is actually the catalyst, or one of the main catalysts behind the debate that occurred between Dr. William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg on the moral argument, which was actually a written debate. And if you go and watch it, that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to follow, is because they wrote everything out, I think, 6 to 8 months in advance, and then they basically just went to a location and then orated what they wrote back and forth to each other, which I think is a wonderful way to do debates. As someone who has done written debates in the past, I've done a few of those actually with atheists. I think it's an amazing way of doing debates. But if you guys have not seen that debate between Dr. Craig and Dr. Wielenberg, I definitely recommend that you guys go and check that out. It's really good. One of my favorite parts is that they actually get into moral knowledge, and that is one version of the moral argument that we didn't really plan to touch on too much today, because we are talking about like what is the best grounds for morality, right? And that's why Adam has kind of given his abductive approach to the moral argument. But there are other versions of the moral argument, like the moral knowledge argument, which says that basically the really the only way to have moral knowledge, which is not the same as like having actual moral truths, moral knowledge about these moral facts. You've actually got to have God sort of designing the process, because otherwise what you have is you have evolution. And there's an analogy actually that a friend of mine, Dustin Crummett, gives in a blog post that he wrote on our website, capturingchristianity.com, where he basically says, and I think he actually got it from another ethicist, I can't remember her name, but it's basically like, she says, imagine like setting sail across the Pacific Ocean and just like hoping that you're going to arrive at the other coast. You don't have any like rowing mechanism or like steering mechanism. You just like set off and you go, and then you just happen to wind at the exact right port across the ocean. And that's sort of the situation that is going on when it comes to like evolutionary theory. It just happens to have been the case that evolutionary theory, or evolutionary history, has led us to these exact correct moral intuitions about what is objectively right and wrong. But that sort of luck seems to be incompatible with knowledge. And a lot of secularists are arguing this, so it's not just like a theistic sort of argument. So I like those arguments, and it's a really cool argument that came up between Dr. Wielenberg and Dr. Craig in their debate. But it looks like we've got Adam back. Let me go ahead and bring him back in.
Yeah,
Adam,
thank you. Sorry
there?
about that.
Adam,
Yeah,
yes.
I like how you're bringing up evolutionary debunking arguments. EDAs is what they're called. And I would say the last whole fourth of my book covers this issue in a lot of very in-depth. Sharon Street is the name of the philosopher.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I call it the lucky...
I wanted to say Susan, but it was close. Sharon.
I call it the lucky coincidence objection, and that's one of the main objections I have against Wielenberg's theory, and he has responses to it, and so I deal with his responses, and I would say that's the whole last fourth of my book is dealing with this very issue. Talking about the Craig and Wielenberg debate, we published that as a book as well. That was published by Routledge. I got to serve as the editor and wrote the first chapter, but then that is all in print as well. We invited several philosophers, atheists and Christians, to write responding chapters, so you can find that in print as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so try to pick up where you left off.
Yeah, so since my approach is more abductive, I can build my theory of morality using all these resources: scripture, theology, and I'm trying to flesh out what is true of reality. I'm not building my theory just starting with objective moral truth and from that alone building to the Trinity. No, I'm fleshing out my theory using Christian theology and scripture to understand what how God exists, what He is like, His Trinitarian nature, and then fleshing out my moral theory using all those things, and then saying that, look, this theory really fits well with what we experience in the moral realm, in our lives, in our understanding of morality. This theory, this Trinitarian theory, makes a whole lot of sense compared to what we're experiencing. And in a sense, it reminds me a lot of Schaeffer. My introduction and background to apologetics and philosophy, I really got started in all of it through the work of Francis Schaeffer. And Schaeffer has this analogy that I think can be helpful in people understanding my theory and how I developed it. And he said it's kind of like when we consider reality around us, the world around us, the universe, our lives, our experiences, and such. That is one aspect, right? And then maybe the other aspect we're discussing is theology, scripture, and it's amazing how well those two things fit together and has explanatory power. That how well our theology and scripture explains the reality that we're experiencing, and those two things seem to fit together really well, giving us more reasons to believe that scripture, that Christianity is in fact true. And he used the example like this. He said it's kind of like finding two halves of a book. Let's say you find there was a book that was ripped in two, and you find half of the book in the basement, and you see half of the book, and maybe you read parts of it as well as you can, since it's only half of the book. But then, let's say later, you find the other half of the book in the attic, and you see how the two halves fit together really well. And that is the analogy he used of what we're doing when we have our experience in the world around us, and then scripture and our Christian beliefs seem to fit really well with reality in the world around us. And so I'm doing something similar in my book, is where I'm developing my theory of morality, trying to explain how God is the source and foundation of morality, and then showing how well that fits with what we actually experience in the moral realm.
So maybe you've already talked about this, and I was just a little bit distracted by some noises that were going on in the background. Tell me why you think that, going back to this question of like, where do explanations stop? Okay, because Eric Wielenberg is just going to say, well, you've just got these brute moral facts. Okay, but why do you think that there's got to be some deeper explanation to these necessary moral truths?
Yeah. Well, and one thing, and this is something that I think Wielenberg helped me to realize, is that every theory does have to have a brute. Not a brute as in a big, hairy, burly guy, but does have to have a stopping point. And this is what I was getting at earlier with the parallels to the first cause argument. Now, Wielenberg, Eric, he might say that every theory needs to have a brute fact. And that's where I would disagree. I would not say that every theory ultimately ends with some sort of brute fact, but every theory does have to have some brute stopping point. And we're proposing, at least I'm proposing, that God is that stopping point, where he's proposing that there are these brute facts, and that's the stopping point. And he makes that exact same parallel in his book, Robust Ethics. He makes that exact same parallel where he's saying, look, my brute facts are very similar to what Christians are proposing that God is. So when you ask Christians, what caused God, or where does God come from? How do you explain God? Well, he just is. And then he uses that and says, my brute facts would have the exact same answer. When you ask, where do they come from? There is no answer. They just are. They just is, right? They've always been there. They're eternal. Nothing caused them. They're just brute. And so, yeah, that's part of the compare and contrast that I'm doing then, is I'm saying, if every theory has to have a brute, what's the most plausible explanation for that brute? And I go through, several chapters explaining why my brute, my God, my stopping point, seems to be a better explanation than his brute ethical facts. Because brute ethical facts, if you want to call them abstract objects, sometimes he does. That's fine. They just don't seem like a very viable candidate for something that exists on their own, right? You can posit that, surely, but they don't seem like something. They seem like something that cries out for an explanation. They don't seem like a very plausible stopping point. And I'm summarizing, several chapters of my book, but I try to make a very robust case that they're not a good candidate for a moral stopping point.
Yeah, what is just we don't have to get into all of the details. What is like one reason why you think that that's not an appropriate stopping point?
Yeah. Well, I call this this objection that I'm making against him is, how did I end up phrasing it? So there's a lucky coincidence objection. Let me grab my book real quick. And that is more the moral knowledge, evolutionary debunking argument. But this other main objection, which is part 3 of the book, is, I call it the bloated model objection. So it's what I'm getting at there for a few chapters is that his model seems to be bloated. So a bloated model objection is saying that he's positing a lot of these abstract objects. He's positing all of these brute facts. And so even he admits that his theory is very well endowed, he calls it. And this has been a criticism that not only us theists have made against theories like Wielenberg's, but even his fellow atheists have made this same case, that his ontology seems to be really full, and he's got to pull in all these things into his ontology to make his theory work. And it ends up, as I call it, a pretty bloated ontology, where ours, in a sense, is a bit more simple, right? We're just positing that there is an ultimate stopping point. There's one God, and he's the ultimate stopping point. It's not that my theory is true because it's more simple, but that is part of the conversation. It's much more nuanced than that, of course.
Yeah, I've actually seen it put. And sorry about there's a dog barking in the background if you guys can hear it. But one of the ways that I've heard this put in another book that I was reading a little while ago is basically that you can compare and contrast, or when you're thinking about the simplicity of theories, there's different ways to cash out simplicity. One way that you can cash out simplicity is the total number of brute facts that a theory posits. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that when it comes to Eric Wielenberg's theory, and this is, again, there's parallels between the moral argument and other cosmological arguments and stuff. But so when it comes to the universe, there's 10 to the 80th different fundamental particles. And if you're a naturalist, you've just got to kind of hold that those simple objects just exist. They're just brute. They have no deeper explanation. They just exist. So you've got 10 to the 80th, something like that, fundamental, unexplained, brute facts. And whereas with theism, you've got one, right? You've got a perfect being who has no arbitrary limits and is the perfect exemplification of all the positive properties and stuff. And it's like, what is the simplicity between that theory, God, and this other theory where you've got 10 to the 80th fundamental particles, but then on top of that, you've got to add in however many necessary facts there are. And so, I was just kind of thinking about the parallels here between, if we're thinking about simplicity, that may be one way to maybe conceptualize what's kind of going on here. The God hypothesis posits one thing that then explains sort of everything else. Whereas if you've got this naturalistic theory, you've kind of got to just build in a lot of these basic, brute facts, so to speak. And that just seems, maybe simplicity is a helpful way to categorize what's going on here.
I think that's a start. I think that's where the conversation can start, and then it goes into much more detail. The other big aspect of his theory is his making relationship. And this is a bit more nuanced. We can get into the nitty-gritties of it. But basically, beyond his just brute ethical facts, he also proposes a brute making relationship. and this is something that came up in the debate with him and Craig. I think Craig called it voodoo metaphysics. And Wielenberg had a nice comeback to that. It was kind of humorous. But basically, Wielenberg is positing that he's got to posit more than just brute facts. And this is why people accuse him of his ontology being bloated, because he's got to have more than just these brute ethical facts. He's got to bring in some sort of making relationship, because how do these brute ethical facts ever connect? It's the same problem that Plato ran into, right? If there are these forms out there in the transcendent realm, how do they ever get down into this realm? And so Wielenberg posits that there are natural properties that instantiate these moral properties. They make them become instantiated. And so it's a very robust making relationship that goes beyond even just a simple supervenience relationship. And it's a more of a direct making. I think he calls it de-supervenience, that it's actually making these initiated, which is, can be considered by some pretty out there. And this is where he leaves a lot of his fellow atheists behind, because they're just not willing to go to this, because it seems a little bit ad hoc. It seems a little convenient to his theory that just these things happen, these natural properties happen to instantiate these moral truths. Now, I will say there's a sense in which it's appropriate to call Wielenberg a naturalist, but there's also a sense in which it's appropriate to call him a non-naturalist. And that's actually a term that he uses to describe himself mostly, is he's not a naturalist. So he's an atheist in that he doesn't believe that there is a God, but he's not a naturalist in the sense that he does believe there are things that exist beyond the natural, physical, material universe, i.e. these brute ethical facts. So his meta-ethical position, like G.E. Moore and others, is usually referred to as non-naturalism.
Well, we've actually got to wrap up the show. I've got some things that I've got to attend to, but I did want to plug the book one more time, Divine Love Theory, from Dr. Adam Lloyd Johnson. You want to get his middle name in there because Adam Johnson is a somewhat common name. So gotta put the middle name in there if you guys want to actually find his stuff online. Adam Lloyd Johnson. I'm really excited to actually finish reading the book. I've started the book, but I haven't gotten to the parts of the book that you've described in this interview that seem super interesting. So I'm looking forward to finishing it out. I wanted to, as we close out the interview, I actually wanted to put something out to you and get your immediate thoughts on it. I haven't discussed this with you prior or anything like that. So feel free to just be like, I don't know about that. I'm just, if you don't have any comments, that's fine. Okay. So the idea, I think we may have touched on it a little bit before we went live. Something I've been toying around with or really over the last just a few days. It seems odd that the world, suppose that Eric's theory is true, or something like Eric's theory is true, where we just got these brute moral facts. Okay, they just exist out there. And it sounds like you were kind of touching on it on the last part about de-supervenience. Is that the term you used? Devenience or de-supervenience? It's such a weird word.
He calls it D, the letter D, dash, and then supervenience. So de-supervenience. Okay.
So like supervenience. So so here's my thought. Okay. It seems like this. Suppose that atheism is true, there is no God, and then suppose that we have these ethical facts. Nevertheless, it still seems super surprising that the world would be set up in such a way, and by set up I don't mean like set up by any divine agent or anything like that. I just mean like the world happens to be this way, where things that we do or the world itself actually is able to even impinge on or be connected to in some way these moral facts. Like these moral facts have some sort of like say in what goes on in this world. It seems like the world could have been set up in all sorts of different ways, kind of going back to like design arguments, fine-tuning arguments. The world could have just been complete chaos, no conscious beings at all, no moral agents at all. Yet there would still be these like ethical facts. But the fact that they're actually applicable in the real world, that seems surprising. And so that's, I think, a different type of argument than like the traditional argument where we're looking at like what is the ground or the basis of these moral facts. This one, I think, is kind of this thought is kind of touching on something similar, I think, to Dr. Craig's case from the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the world, where like these mathematical truths are just like, how do those interact with the natural world? That seems kind of odd and weird. And I think I'm kind of hitting at the same sort of intuition here when it comes to moral facts. It just seems, even if you've got these ethical truths that just exist, it still seems really weird that the world is set up in such a way in which they're applicable.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that before we close out?
Yeah, I agree. I think it goes back to that. Sorry, I'm getting sirens here now. But
they
it goes
heard my
back
argument.
to
They were like, "We've got to shut this down."
coming after you. Evolutionary debunking arguments, and going back to Sharon Street, or even Plato's original dilemma, right? If Plato proposed that there are these forms out there, it's like he still has to explain why we're participating in them or how we can know them. And he had a pretty elaborate theory, is that we are actually from that transcendent realm and we're just remembering these things. But yeah, there does seem to be an odd connection between the moral realm and the fact that we're experiencing it and we participate in it. And I think that does cry out for an explanation. And of course, I think Christianity is the best explanation. Couple of things that I was going to throw out there real quick here at the end. I'm the president of a ministry called Convincing Proof, and it's a general apologetics and evangelism ministry. So we've got a lot of resources at convincingproof.org, not only on the moral argument, but all aspects of apologetics. Convincing Proof is what I do full-time as a ministry. And then I've got 2 debates coming up in April that people can look forward to. So 2 atheist philosophers have reached out to me to debate them on this issue. One of them is going to be at the University of Texas at Austin on April 17th. I'm going to be debating an Ayn Rand scholar, Ben Bayer. So he's arguing Ayn Rand's theory of morality. Again, atheist, believes in objective morality, different than Wielenberg, but he's going to be putting forth his theory. I'm going to be arguing that my theory is a better explanation for objective morality. And then the other debate is also going to be in April, but it's going to be at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln. And it's, I think, April 23rd, 24th. It's the Wednesday of that week. And I'm going to be debating James Sturba. So Dr. Sturba is a philosophy professor at Notre Dame. And so he's working, obviously, at one of the highest academic levels as an atheist, believes in objective moral truth, and reached out to me in the fall and wants to debate. He wants to make a case that there can be objective moral truth even if there is no God. And so he wanted to debate me on this, and we'll have that in April as well, me and James Sturba.
That's so cool. Actually, you and I coordinate after the show and talk about the one that you've got in Texas. Maybe we can partner some way with Capturing Christianity, maybe live stream it here. We'll talk about all the particulars there. I think that'd be really cool. If anything, I'd be happy to at least go and meet you. So,
that'd be great.
But it's been great to have you on the show. Again, can't wait to dig deeper into your book, but definitely appreciate you taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your continued support. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. See